Ever get that feeling? Like you're swimming in an ocean of words and you just wish you had I don't know, a life raft or something, some kind of cheat sheet to make sense of it all. What if I told you that by focusing on just a tiny sliver, a really small percentage of those words, you could actually unlock a huge chunk of understanding?
Well, that's kind of the premise behind what we're diving into today. We're leaving behind all those fancy, obscure terms, and we're not even getting bogged down in the grammar rules for now. Today, it's all about the core, the absolute essentials, the 1,000 most common words in the English language.
And we're basing this on research from EF Global site, a pretty reputable source when it comes to language learning.
Exactly. Now, I know 1,000 words might still sound like a lot to wrap your head around.
Right.
But the thing is, this isn't just some random assortment of vocabulary. This list is built on data, on how often these words actually show up in real-life communication in English.
Yeah, how much they get used day in and day out.
Precisely. So our mission today isn't to turn you into a walking dictionary, to, have you memorize this entire list.
No flashcard drills here.
Exactly. Instead, we're going to try to unpack what the sheer frequency of these words tells us about the English language itself, about its fundamental structure, its priorities, the backbone of how it all works.
Kind of a peek behind the curtain of language, you could say.
Exactly. And trust me, this stuff can get surprisingly fascinating.
I think so.
Even if you're not, sitting in a classroom studying English right now.
Right.
If you encounter English at all in your daily life, if you work with it, if you just have a general interest in language.
Right.
Or of course, if you're learning it, getting a grasp on the power of these core words can really open your eyes to how language functions.
So let's jump right into this idea of frequency, right?
Right.
What does it actually mean that these are the most common words? It's not like they're the fanciest or the most sophisticated, right?
Not necessarily, no. But it is about statistics. It's about the data, showing that these words pop up again and again, much more frequently than others.
It's almost like they're the workhorses of the language.
Exactly. They're doing the heavy lifting.
Yeah. And that makes you wonder, doesn't it? What kind of impact does that have, focusing on these linguistic workhorses, these most common words?
Well, the impact is actually pretty significant. While the EF data we're looking at doesn't give us specific percentages,
right,
it's a well-established fact in linguistics that a really small core vocabulary, a relatively small number of words, accounts for a disproportionately large percentage of the words we actually use and encounter, both in speaking and in writing.
Oh, that's interesting. So a small group of words punches way above its weight.
Exactly. It's like, imagine building with Legos, right? And you've got all these different bricks.
Yeah, all shapes and sizes.
But there are certain bricks, certain shapes and sizes that you find yourself reaching for again and again.
Right, those classic blocks.
Those are your most versatile bricks, your most frequently used ones. And mastering those, understanding how they fit together, that gives you an incredible foundation for building anything you can imagine. It's the same with language.
That makes sense. So the EF list, it presents these 1,000 words alphabetically, which is logical enough, I guess, as a starting point.
Right, because it's a good way to organize them.
But for our deep dive today, I think it's actually way more revealing to look at them in categories, to group them based on their function and meaning.
Absolutely.
And the first thing that just jumps out at me when I look at this list is the sheer number of what I think of as like the glue words of the language.
The glue words. I like that.
The words that hold everything together. We're talking articles like a and the.
Right.
Prepositions like in, on, at, to, from.
Yeah.
All those conjunctions like and, but, or.
Yeah.
And then, of course, the pronouns he, she, it, you. They are everywhere.
It's true. And what's so fascinating about these seemingly tiny, almost invisible words is how incredibly essential they are for creating clear communication. Like, just think about the for a second. It instantly signals that you're talking about a specific noun, not just any noun. It narrows things down immediately.
Right.
And then you've got prepositions, which define relationships between things.
Right.
Relationships in space, in time, even in logic. The book is on the table versus the book is under the table. Those prepositions tell you completely different things about where that book is.
Yeah, the relationship between the book and the table.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And conjunctions, they allow us to link ideas together, to show contrasts, to add information, to present alternatives.
And, but, or.
Exactly. Imagine trying to express a complex thought without those words. It would be like trying to build a house without any nails or screws.
Yeah.
It would just fall apart.
Or like a Lego creation without those little connecting pieces.
Exactly. It would just be a jumble of bricks.
It's just a pile. So really, their high frequency, the fact that these words are so common, it just underscores how much language is about relationships, about connections between things.
Absolutely. It's about creating meaning through those connections.
Okay, so we've got the glue.
The glue.
But what about the engines? The words that really drive the action of our sentences?
Yes, the verbs.
The verbs. The list is packed with them. Be, have, do, say, go, make, note, take, see, and come. Just to name a few, it's kind of hard to even picture forming a thought without reaching for one of these.
It really is. These verbs, they represent such fundamental actions, states of being, even possession. And their versatility is incredible.
Yeah, just think about how many ways you can use a word like go, for example.
Oh, absolutely. You can go to the store, you can go crazy, you can go without, you can go on. And each one of those phrases paints a completely different picture.
Different nuances.
Exactly. So the prominence of these verbs, these action words, really highlights how dynamic English is, how much emphasis it puts on doing and being.
Action and existence.
Exactly. And it makes you wonder, in languages where verb conjugation, we're changing the verb to match the subject and the tense is less complicated.
Yeah.
Do they express some of these concepts in fundamentally different ways?
Yeah.
Maybe relying more on the context or other grammatical structures. It's an interesting question.
Oh, that's a really good question. It's like each language has its own way of carving up meaning. So we've talked about glue words, verbs. What about the things we're actually talking about? The nouns.
The nouns, yes.
And again, the list is full of these everyday essentials. Time, people, way, year, day, thing, man, woman, child, house, work. It seems to reflect those core elements of human experience, wouldn't you say?
I think that's a great observation. The frequency of these nouns, it kind of offers a snapshot of our daily lives, of our concerns, our interactions.
Yeah, the stuff we think about and talk about all the time.
Exactly. Like time is this constant framework for everything we do.
We're always thinking about time.
People are at the heart of our social world. And then you've got work, which for many people occupies a significant portion of their time, their identity even.
Yeah, what you do for a living.
Their prominence on this list, it just suggests those fundamental realities that shape our conversations, and even our understanding of the world around us.
So, okay, we've got the glue words, the verbs, the nouns, but a sentence made up of just those would be pretty bland, wouldn't it?
Yeah, it would lack a certain something.
It would be kind of like a black and white sketch. What about the words that add color, that add detail, the adjectives and adverbs?
Yes, those descriptive words that bring everything to life.
Right. And we see plenty of those on the list. Good, new, first, last, long, great, little, and then adverbs like also, very often, however. They might not be the stars of the sentence, but they're doing a lot of important work behind the scenes.
Absolutely. Those modifiers allow us to be much more precise in our language, more expressive.
Yeah.
A good day conveys a very different feeling than a bad day. And running quickly paints a different image in your mind than simply running.
You get a better sense of what's going on.
Exactly. The frequency of adverbs like however is particularly interesting, I think. It suggests that in English, there's a real need to express contrast, to show nuance, to consider different perspectives.
Right.
It kind of points to a culture of discussion and debate, of weighing different options.
Always looking at both sides of the coin.
Exactly.
Okay, so we've covered those more basic building blocks, but there's another category on this list that I find really intriguing, and these are the words that relate to broader societal structures, to abstract concepts. We're talking words like government, company, school, education, health, problem, question, answer, idea, and information.
Yeah, those are interesting ones.
It's like they offer a glimpse into the institutions and the intellectual pursuits that are central to, to English-speaking societies.
Absolutely. And it's not just that they're present, it's how much weight they carry. Their frequency on this list speaks volumes.
Right. Like you mentioned earlier, the prominence of information in the list really says something about our current age, our information-driven society.
It really does. And the presence of words like problem and question right alongside it. That might suggest a certain cultural tendency towards analysis, towards problem solving, towards questioning the status quo. It's like this list is a subtle fingerprint, revealing something about the values and priorities of English-speaking cultures.
That's fascinating. And it's almost as interesting to think about what's not prominently featured on this list. You won't find a ton of specialized jargon, words from very specific professions or niche hobbies, right? This really does focus on that shared foundation of language, those words we all use to communicate.
That's a really key point. This list isn't meant to be comprehensive. It's not a dictionary. It's more like, the basic toolkit you need to start building.
The essential tool.
Exactly. If you're a botanist, you're going to need a whole other set of specialized vocabulary to talk about plants.
Right. Specific terms.
But those core words, those 1,000 most common words, those are still going to be essential for you to communicate with other botanists, to explain your research to people outside your field, to write about it, to think about it. It's the common ground.
The foundation. So, okay, let's shift gears a little bit here.
Okay.
And talk to the listener directly. Whether you're actively studying English right now or you just want to get a better handle on how it works, how can you actually use this list as a tool? It is just a list of words on a page, after all.
Right. Well, the EF Global site itself offers some practical suggestions, like using flashcards or other memory aids to get familiar with the words. But honestly, I think the most valuable approach is to simply start paying more attention to how those words show up in the English you're already encountering. Whether you're reading an article, watching a video, or even just listening to a conversation about something that interests you. Yet try to tune in to how often these core words pop up. You might be surprised by how much of the meaning they carry, even in really complex sentences.
So it's almost like a little mental game.
Exactly. It's about active observation.
Right.
And it's not just about recognizing the word, knowing its basic definition from the dictionary.
Right. It's not about just memorizing.
Exactly. A word like take, for example, can have so many different meanings depending on the context, on the words it's paired with.
So many different uses.
Exactly. So it's about understanding the nuances, the different ways these words function grammatically. Pay attention to how prepositions change the meaning of verbs, like take off versus take in.
Right.
Or how the same noun can be used in all these different situations. It's about developing a flexible understanding of how these words work, not just a rote memorization of their definitions.
It's about seeing them in action. And this really highlights how even those little function words, the glue words we talked about earlier, the ones that might seem kind of insignificant on their own, they're absolutely crucial for creating coherent meaning. Their high frequency, it's not an accident.
No, it really underscores their importance in the structure of the language.
Holding everything together.
They're like the scaffolding.
The framework.
The grammatical scaffolding that lets us construct these really complex ideas from relatively simple vocabulary.
Building up from that foundation.
Exactly.
So if we were to sum it all up, this deep dive into the 1,000 most common English words, courtesy of EF Global Site.
Right.
It really reveals that mastering those core words, understanding how they work, it's a surprisingly powerful key to unlocking the English language. It's not about memorizing obscure terms. It's about appreciating those fundamental building blocks, the ones that underpin so much of how we communicate, both in speaking and in writing.
Absolutely. It's a reminder that sometimes the most important thing is to really get a handle on the basics, to understand those core concepts. And that's true whether you're actively learning a language or just someone who's fascinated by the way language works.
And for me, thinking about these as the most frequent words, the ones that pop up constantly in English, it sparks a question, doesn't it?
What's that?
What does their prominence, what does the fact that these are the words we use the most, what does that tell us about the English-speaking world, about our core concepts, our values, the ways we interact with each other? What kind of picture does it paint? And then I started thinking, well, what if you did a similar analysis for the most common words in your own field of expertise?
Oh, it's a great question.
What surprising terms might bubble up to the top of that list? And what would that reveal about the focus, about the priorities of that specific domain? It's definitely something to ponder, isn't it?
It really is. Lots to think about. Hey everyone, welcome back for another deep dive. We get a ton of questions from you guys about speaking more fluently. And a lot of you say the same thing. You've learned a good amount of vocabulary. You can get the gist when you're reading or listening to English.
But when you actually need to open your mouth and speak, it's like
hitting a wall.
Yeah, it's like you freeze up, you know the words, but you just can't get them out in a smooth sentence.
Exactly. It's like having all these ingredients, but no clue how to put them together into an actual dish.
That is a perfect analogy. Because knowing individual words is one thing, but speaking fluently is about...
It's about using those words correctly in sentences.
Right, like understanding the patterns and structures that native speakers use naturally without even thinking about it.
Okay, so that's exactly what we're diving into today. We've got this resource called 100 Common English Phrases and Sentence Patterns. Now, I know.
100. That sounds like a lot.
Right. At first glance, it seems pretty overwhelming.
It does. Like, where do you even begin with that many? But the idea here is actually super smart. This resource says that if you really focus on these common phrases and patterns, these fundamental building blocks that English speakers use all the time,
you're essentially learning the core framework of the language, not just memorizing a bunch of random words.
Yeah. Instead of getting lost in this huge sea of vocabulary, you're learning the essential structures that let you create tons of different sentences.
It's like, have you ever put together one of those, like, build-it-yourself furniture kits?
Oh, yeah, from,
like the big Swedish furniture store?
IKEA. Yes, exactly.
So you get all these separate pieces, and it's super intimidating at first.
Totally.
But then you realize that this is one little tool.
The little Allen wrench.
The Allen wrench.
Yeah.
And that one tool helps you put almost everything together.
Right. You're not using a different tool for every single screw or piece.
Exactly. And these sentence patterns, they're like that Allen wrench for English. They're the key to putting the language together.
I love that. So the resource makes this point that even just mastering one of these common phrases can give you so much flexibility.
Because once you understand the underlying structure, you can swap out different words to create all kinds of variations.
You're not stuck memorizing individual sentences. You're learning how to build your own.
And the beautiful thing is, these patterns are used constantly in everyday conversations.
So you'll start to recognize them everywhere once you know what to look for.
You'll hear them in movies, in songs, in podcasts like this one.
And you'll think, oh, I know that pattern. I can use that too. Okay, so this resource talks about something called deep learning. It emphasizes repetition.
Like not just reading through the list once and calling it a day.
Right. It actually recommends focusing on about 5 of these phrases or patterns every day.
And really taking the time to understand them inside and out.
It also talks about listening to real English, which
might seem obvious.
But it's so important because,
you can learn grammar rules from a textbook, but hearing how native speakers actually use the language.
Yeah, that's what helps you develop a natural flow and rhythm.
It's about absorbing those subtle nuances that you might not pick up from just reading.
Okay, so we know 100 phrases sounds a bit daunting. That's a lot to digest all at once.
It is. And we're not going to try to go through every single one here.
Right. What we're going to do is...
Well, we're going to break down the key principles.
Yeah, the core idea behind why focusing on these common structures is so helpful for improving your fluency.
We want to give you that foundation so you can apply this to any new phrases you encounter.
So let's talk about this foundational idea. English, like all languages, relies so heavily on these recurring patterns.
Why do you think that is? I mean, why do we use the same phrases and structures over and over again?
Well, it's all about efficiency, right? If every time we wanted to express an idea, we had to invent a completely new sentence structure, it would be exhausting.
Exactly. It would be like reinventing the wheel every time you wanted to go for a drive.
And communication would be so much slower.
Right. So these common phrases, they're like shortcuts. They're tried and true ways of getting your message across quickly and clearly.
And they make it easier for the listener to understand you because they're already familiar with these patterns.
Exactly. They're expecting to hear them. Okay, so the resource gives a bunch of examples. Let's dive into a few to see how this works in real life.
Okay, let's start with a really simple one. Are you sure?
So basic, but so useful.
I know, right? Yeah. It's a question we use all the time in tons of different situations.
It's all about seeking confirmation. Like when you need to double check something.
Are you sure you locked the door?
Are you sure you sent that email?
Or maybe someone tells you something surprising and you're like, wait, are you sure about that?
It can also express a bit of doubt,
Yeah.
Like, are you sure you want to do that? It seems risky.
And the structure is always the same. Are you sure? Followed by whatever you want to confirm.
Yeah, so you can plug in all kinds of different statements.
It's a super adaptable pattern.
Okay, how about another one? Do you have cheater available? This one's super common.
Especially when you're shopping or looking for information.
Right, like, do you have this shirt in a larger size?
Or if you're at a restaurant and you want to know if they have a certain dish.
Do you have the lasagna available?
Or you could even use it for things like, do you have any time available next week to meet?
Though you might phrase it a bit differently in a more formal context.
Right, you might say something like, would you be available to meet next week?
But the core idea is the same.
Yeah.
Checking if something is accessible or obtainable.
Okay, last one. I'm looking forward to, this one's a classic.
It's all about expressing anticipation or excitement about something in the future.
Yeah, like I'm looking forward to the weekend.
Or I'm looking forward to seeing you again.
I'm looking forward to my vacation.
It's a really common way to build positive connections and share your enthusiasm.
Now, the resource really emphasizes this deep learning idea. What would you say are some practical ways for our listeners to actually engage in that kind of learning with these phrases?
So deep learning isn't about just memorizing the phrase. It's about truly understanding why it's structured the way it is.
Like breaking it down.
Yeah, breaking it down. What are the different parts? Why are they in that order? And what kinds of words typically fit into the blanks?
So for "are you sure?", you might think about, what kinds of situations do I use this in? What kinds of responses do I get?
Exactly. You're going beyond the surface level meaning and really exploring how the phrase works.
Almost like taking it apart and putting it back together again?
Yes. And another great technique is to actually practice using the phrase in different contexts.
Like imagining different scenarios.
Exactly. So for "I'm looking forward to."
Oh,
You could think about upcoming events in your own life and make a few sentences.
I'm looking forward to that concert next month.
I'm looking forward to trying that new restaurant. The more you use the phrase actively, even if it's just in your head, the better you'll understand it.
And then the resource talks about listening to real English. How does that tie in to deep learning?
Well, when you hear these phrases being used naturally by native speakers, you pick up on all those subtle cues.
Like the rhythm, the intonation.
Exactly. You start to get a feel for how the phrase sounds in different contexts.
And you might even notice variations or informal ways of saying the same thing.
Right. Language isn't always about following strict rules.
It's about understanding how people actually use it.
Exactly. And listening to real English helps you bridge that gap between knowing the phrase and actually using it naturally.
The source also mentions that it's really helpful to review these patterns frequently, even if it's just for a few minutes at a time.
Like while you're commuting or waiting in line or something.
Yeah, those little moments throughout the day can really add up.
Because it's all about repetition and keeping these phrases fresh in your mind.
And for those who really want to dive deeper into this method, the resource actually offers a downloadable package.
Oh, cool. What's in the package?
It includes audio recordings of all 100 phrases spoken by native speakers.
That's amazing.
And it also has transcripts so you can follow along.
So it's like having a personal English tutor in your pocket.
Exactly. And it's a great way to get that consistent exposure to the sounds of these phrases.
Because remember, language is primarily auditory. We learn by hearing and imitating.
Okay, so to sum up, if you're comfortable with vocabulary but struggling to speak fluently,
focusing on these common patterns is a really effective strategy.
it's about learning the core building blocks of spoken English, not just collecting individual words.
And it's about understanding how those blocks fit together to create natural, flowing sentences.
And remember, the journey to fluency isn't about passive memorization, it's about active engagement.
It's about breaking down these phrases, practicing them, and listening to how native speakers use them.
So here's a challenge for you as you go about your day today. Pay attention to how people use language.
Especially those common phrases we talked about.
Think about situations where you could try using one of them yourself.
And don't be afraid to experiment. The more you use them, the more natural they'll become.
And if you're looking for more resources to help you on your journey, well, remember,
there are so many great podcasts, websites, and apps out there.
find the ones that work best for you and keep practicing.
Keep diving deep.
Until next time.
See you then. All right, welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today we're taking a look at something I think a lot of our listeners are interested in, and that's improving your English language skills.
For sure.
And we're going to be drawing on this really amazing resource for this deep dive.
Absolutely.
It's a blog post with 100 practical tips.
Wow, that's a lot.
It is. It's called 100 Helpful Tips for IELTS and ESL Students.
ESL.
Yeah. And this comes from Hester, who's the Director of Studies over at Langports, Brisbane.
Okay, yeah.
So these are all tips that come from experience.
Yeah.
So no matter what level you're at with English, you know, whether you're just starting out or you consider yourself pretty fluent, you know, there's always room to improve.
Of course.
And this is a great way to kind of just cut through all the noise out there.
Right.
Because there's a lot of advice out there.
Yeah,
This is focusing on what really works.
absolutely.
And, you know, it's such a variety of advice. So we're talking everything from grammar and vocabulary, which are sort of like the building blocks of English.
Right.
But also just like mindset shifts and daily habits.
Yeah.
Things that you can do to just really become better at English.
Love it.
So our goal for this deep dive is to, pull out some of the most impactful advice, maybe even some surprising advice from this really extensive list.
Okay.
And, we want to give you things that you can take away and immediately start using.
Yeah, I like that. Actionable.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So let's just jump right into it. The first tip that Hester offers is, don't be afraid to make mistakes.
Yeah.
Be confident.
It sounds pretty basic, but I feel like people really get tripped up on this.
Right. Why is that so crucial?
Well, I mean, it's interesting because they've done studies and they've shown that students who actually try to use new language, even if they're wrong,
Right.
they make more progress.
Well, that's interesting.
Versus the students that are too scared to say anything because they might be wrong.
So it's almost like in making the mistake, you're sort of alerting your brain to, hey, pay attention.
That's right, yeah.
This is how you do it.
It's like vital feedback,
Yeah.
and it's actually how we learn anything new, not just language.
Right.
But especially language, yeah.
Yeah, that's so interesting.
And I think that also ties into, the idea of creating that English-speaking environment.
Right.
So that you can sort of passively learn through active speaking, just by trying to use the language.
Right.
Even if you're not studying those particular elements at that moment,
Okay.
you're still absorbing it.
That makes sense. So you're getting feedback and you're also just constantly surrounding yourself with English.
Exactly.
Okay, cool. All right, now let's talk about study habits.
Yes.
So Hester talks about having a study plan, practicing daily.
Right.
She even says, tell your family and friends about your study plan.
Okay.
Why is that? Why bring your family and friends into this?
I think it's all about creating a system of accountability so that, if you're telling your family and friends, they're going to be asking you, how are you doing with your English?
Right. You've got this support network.
Exactly. Yeah.
They're going to help you to stay on track.
Right.
Interesting. Now, the blog post also draws a distinction between short-term goals.
Okay.
Like, let's say you have a test coming up.
Right.
And then long-term goals.
I see.
Really thinking about, how is English going to improve your life?
Yeah.
So what's the value in thinking about those long-term goals?
I think that's where the real motivation comes from because, a short-term goal, you can stay focused on it.
Right.
But to really fuel your efforts over a long period of time, you got to think about those long-term goals.
So you're thinking about how English is going to improve your life.
Right. Yeah.
What opportunities it's going to open up for you.
Exactly.
Okay. So we've got those short-term goals to keep us on track. But then those long-term goals are the ones that are really going to keep us motivated.
Exactly.
Okay. Now let's talk about the core skills of English. Reading, writing, speaking, and listening.
Yes.
And obviously, it goes without saying that you got to practice all of those.
Right.
But I wanted to zoom in on vocabulary building because the blog post suggests keeping a vocabulary notebook.
Right.
But it also says to actively use new words.
Okay.
So why is that? Why isn't it enough just to write the words down?
I think it's because you're engaging different parts of your memory. So if you're writing a word down, and then maybe even writing a sentence with it, and then saying that sentence out loud a couple of times, you're really getting all of the senses involved.
Yeah, so you're not just seeing the word. You're hearing it.
Yeah.
You're saying it.
Yeah, and that helps it to stick more.
That makes sense. So it's that multi-sensory approach that really helps.
Yeah, and it's a lot different than just memorizing lists of words.
Right, which is how I remember learning vocabulary in school.
Yeah, exactly.
I would have these quizzes.
Yeah.
Where I had to write out the definitions.
Right.
And it was like gone the next day.
Exactly.
Yeah. So the blog post also says, to learn words in context. So through example sentences.
Yeah.
How does that help?
Well, you're understanding the nuances of the word. You're seeing how it functions in real communication.
Right.
It's not just an isolated word.
Right. Yeah.
You're actually understanding how to use it.
Okay, that makes sense.
Yeah.
Now, recognizing that everyone learns in their own way.
Right.
Hester highlights the importance of personalized learning strategies.
Okay.
She says, know what works best for you.
Yeah, I love that.
Think about how you've successfully learned things in the past. So how can someone actually figure that out for themselves?
Well, I think you have to be really honest with yourself and look back at times where you have successfully learned things and, think about what methods you use.
Right.
And try to figure out, Are you someone who remembers things best by writing them out, by reading them, by talking to people about it?
Right.
You know, the blog post mentions various learning styles, and, you know, the importance of your study environment. You know, do you like to study in a quiet place by yourself, or do you prefer a group environment?
Right.
The key is just to try different things out.
Right.
And pay attention to what works for you.
And be honest with yourself.
Exactly.
And I think that goes back to something that she said, which is don't be afraid to ask for help.
Yes.
You know, if you're struggling with something, it's okay to reach out for help.
Absolutely. That's so important.
Yeah. Okay. So now let's talk about effective study techniques.
Okay.
And I feel like regular review is something that's pretty obvious to a lot of people.
Right. Yeah.
You know, go back and review what you've learned. But what's interesting is the blog post suggests taking breaks about every 30 minutes.
I see.
So why such short intervals?
Well, it has to do with the way our brains process information.
Okay.
If we focus for too long, we actually start to retain less.
Oh, interesting.
So those short breaks really help us to reset our focus.
Right.
And prevent mental fatigue.
I see.
And it also gives our brains time to consolidate the new material.
So it's almost like taking those breaks
Yeah.
is actually helping to cement
Totally.
that knowledge
Absolutely.
in our minds.
Yeah.
Interesting. And the blog post also advises against rushing to higher levels. Why is that?
Well, it's important to have a really solid foundation.
Okay.
So you don't want to rush ahead
Right.
and then, you know, find yourself struggling later on because you didn't really master the basics.
So it's about, you know, really mastering the level that you're at
Exactly.
before moving on.
Yeah.
Okay. Now let's talk about using different types of media to learn English.
Okay. Love that.
So, you know, one of the things that Hester talks about is watching DVDs. And she suggests that they're good for repeated viewing
Right.
compared to, you know, let's say watching TV. So why is that? Why is that ability to rewatch something so important?
I think that's all about deeper comprehension.
Okay.
So when you watch something multiple times, you're really able to pick up on the nuances of the language.
So you can maybe focus on pronunciation one time,
Yeah.
you know, focus on certain vocabulary another time,
Totally.
or maybe even just, you know, kind of get a feel for the rhythm and intonation of the language.
Right. Absolutely.
And TV, on the other hand, you're just sort of getting one exposure. So it's more suited for those who are at a higher level, who are just kind of trying to maintain their English,
Yeah.
or maybe practice in a more spontaneous setting.
Yeah.
Okay, that makes sense. And she also recommends reading graded readers
Okay.
and children's books.
I like that. That's a good idea.
So, you know, I think some people might feel that that's too basic for them.
Right.
You know, why read something that's for kids?
Yeah.
But what's the value in using these simpler texts?
Well, I think it all comes down to comprehensible input.
Okay.
So if you're reading something that's too difficult,
Mm-hmm.
you're not really going to learn anything.
Right.
You're just going to get frustrated.
Right.
So, you know, graded readers and children's books are specifically designed for people learning English.
Mm-hmm.
So the vocabulary is going to be manageable.
Right.
The grammar is going to be manageable.
Yeah.
And it's a great way to just build your confidence and improve your overall comprehension.
And I think the other thing with children's books is they often have pictures.
Yeah,
So it can kind of help you to understand the meaning, even if you don't know every single word.
totally. Absolutely.
And Hester also recommends something that I thought was really interesting,
Yep.
which is to look for the passive voice in newspapers. Have you heard of this before?
No, I haven't.
Yeah. So this is a specific exercise
Oh, I see.
that you can do to really get a handle on the passive voice,
Okay.
which can be really tricky for learners of English,
Right.
but it's a way to kind of see it in action.
Yeah.
Okay. Now, when it comes to reading, you know, more challenging materials, the blog post suggests that you read for the general meaning first,
Okay.
and only then go back and look up unfamiliar words.
I see.
And I feel like a lot of people would kind of feel like that's backwards.
Yeah, I could see that.
You know, like, shouldn't you know what all the words mean first?
Right.
But what's the benefit of reading for the general meaning first?
Well, I think it helps you to develop reading fluency.
Okay.
So if you're constantly stopping to look up words,
Right.
you're never really going to get into the flow of the text.
Right.
So if you just try to get the general meaning first, you can go back later and look up the words that you don't know.
Right.
But you're not going to lose the thread of what you're reading.
And you're not going to get discouraged
Exactly.
by all those unfamiliar words.
Yeah.
And the other thing is if you wait to look up the word, you have the context of the sentence
Right.
to help you understand it.
Totally.
So you might be able to figure out the meaning without even having to look it up.
Absolutely.
The blog post also talks about this really useful technique for vocabulary building,
Okay.
which is learning root words, prefixes,
Prefixes. Okay.
suffixes.
Suffixes.
So how does that help you with your vocabulary?
Well, I think it helps you to see patterns in words.
Oh,
So if you know that scrib means write, then you can figure out words like scribe,
right.
script,
Mm-hmm.
prescription.
Exactly.
Exactly. Or if you know that min means small, you can figure out words like minute, miniature,
Okay.
minimal.
And then prefixes and suffixes.
Yeah.
Those are kind of like little add-ons to words
Exactly.
that can change their meaning.
Yeah.
So like means not.
Right.
So happy, unhappy,
Right.
and then suffixes like illy often make an adjective into an adverb.
Right. Yeah.
So quickly,
Yeah.
that kind of thing.
Totally.
So, if you can break down the words into their parts, it becomes a lot easier to figure out what they mean.
Absolutely.
Okay, cool. Now let's talk about pronunciation,
All right.
which can be a really tricky area for English language learners.
Yeah.
The blog post mentions word stress in English, and it contrasts English with languages like Japanese or French.
Okay.
So how is word stress different in English?
So in English, the placement of stress within a word can completely change its meaning.
Oh, wow.
Or its grammatical function. Whereas, in other languages like French, each syllable might have a more equal weight.
Right.
But in English, we emphasize certain syllables.
Right.
And that emphasis is key to being understood clearly.
So it's not just about pronouncing the sounds correctly.
Right. Exactly.
It's also about stressing the right syllable.
Totally.
Okay, and the blog post gives this kind of like basic rule of thumb for two-syllable words.
Okay.
It says that verbs tend to stress the second syllable, and nouns and adjectives tend to stress the first.
Okay.
So, for example, the word present. If you're talking about a gift,
Yeah.
it's present.
Right.
But if you're talking about giving something to someone, it's present.
That's right. That's a great example.
Yeah, so it can really change the meaning of the word.
Absolutely.
All right, now Hester also mentioned something called shadowing.
Oh, yeah.
And she recommends shadowing English CDs, or maybe even reading aloud with mirror CDs. So what are those and how does that work?
So shadowing is when you listen to someone speaking English and you try to repeat what they're saying
Okay.
at the same time.
So you're basically mimicking
Yeah, exactly.
the speaker.
Yeah, you're mimicking their pronunciation,
Okay.
their intonation,
Right.
their rhythm.
And then what about mirror CDs?
So mirror CDs are similar, but you're reading aloud from a text
Okay.
and you're trying to match the pace and the intonation of the speaker on the CD.
So it's almost like you're having a conversation with the CD.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
And it's a great way to get feedback on your own pronunciation and intonation.
Okay, and then the blog post also suggests recording yourself speaking English, which can be kind of awkward,
Yeah.
but what's the benefit of doing that?
Well, you can identify any pronunciation or intonation issues that you're not aware of.
So when we hear ourselves speaking, it can be very different
Totally.
from how we think we sound.
Yeah, and it's really helpful to be able to hear yourself objectively.
Okay, now let's talk about a specific sound in English
Okay.
that the blog post describes as the most common vowel sound in English.
Okay.
This is the schwa sound.
The schwa, I love that sound.
So can you explain what that is and why it's so important for English language learners?
So the schwa is that unstressed neutral vowel sound.
Okay.
It's like a relaxed like the A in about
Okay.
or the U in supply.
I see.
And because English has so many unstressed syllables in words and sentences, the schwa sound appears all the time.
Okay.
So it's really important for learners to be able to recognize it,
Okay.
both in terms of understanding spoken English and also in terms of producing it themselves.
Okay.
So if you can master the schwa, your English is going to sound much more natural and fluid.
Okay, that makes sense. Now let's talk about the connection between thinking and communicating in English. So the blog post really stresses the importance of trying to think directly in English
Right.
rather than constantly translating from your native language.
Right, yeah.
So that sounds like a big mental shift. How can someone start to do that?
Well, you have to start small.
Okay.
So try to formulate simple sentences in your head in English, even if they're basic.
Right.
And, Hester actually suggests talking to yourself in English,
Okay.
which might sound a little crazy,
Right.
but it can be really helpful.
Yeah, I guess that makes sense.
Yeah.
You're just practicing.
Exactly.
Getting those thought patterns going in English.
Yeah. And the more you practice, the easier it will become.
And the blog post makes this analogy to learning to drive,
Oh, yeah.
which I thought was really interesting.
Yeah.
You can read the instruction manual, but until you actually get behind the wheel and start driving, you're not really going to learn how to drive.
Right.
It's the same with English.
Yeah, you got to just do it.
You just got to do it.
Yeah.
And the blog post also makes this point about grammar, often being naturally acquired through speaking.
Yeah.
So that's kind of encouraging.
Yeah.
You don't have to memorize all the grammar rules,
Right.
just by speaking.
Yeah.
And listening to English, you'll start to absorb the grammar.
Yeah. And make those connections.
Okay.
Yeah.
Now let's talk about writing.
Okay.
So the blog post gives a range of advice for improving your writing skills.
Okay.
Everything from keeping a personal English diary to launching an online blog.
Oh, wow. That's a big leap.
It is.
Yeah.
So what do you think about those two different approaches?
Well, I think keeping a diary is a really good way to just practice writing without any pressure. It's just for you. You can write about whatever you want.
Yeah.
You don't have to worry about anyone judging you.
Right.
Start small. Maybe just write a few sentences each day.
Okay.
And then, gradually increase the amount you write over time.
And then a blog is a very different experience.
Yeah, definitely.
Because you have an audience. So how does that change things?
Well, it can be really motivating
Okay.
to know that other people are going to be reading what you write.
Right.
And it can also give you an opportunity to get feedback on your writing from native speakers
Okay.
or other English language learners.
So it's a good way to kind of put yourself out there
Yeah,
and get some real world feedback.
absolutely.
And then the blog post also talks about this process for improving your writing. So you start by brainstorming your ideas,
Okay.
then you structure them logically.
Okay.
You write your first draft,
Right.
and then you proofread your work. And I love that the blog post emphasizes punctuation.
Yeah.
With this really kind of funny example
Okay.
about the importance of punctuation.
Okay.
So it says, a woman without her man is nothing,
Right.
versus a woman without her man is nothing.
That's great. Yeah.
So it's just a funny way to kind of show how punctuation can really change
Yeah,
the meaning of a sentence.
absolutely.
Okay, now let's talk about actively immersing yourself in the English language.
Okay. Love it.
So one of the things the blog post suggests is learning English songs and singing along.
Yeah.
So how does that help you learn English?
Well, I think it's a fun way to improve your vocabulary,
Okay.
your pronunciation, and your understanding of English rhythm and intonation.
Yeah.
Music is really powerful.
Yeah.
It can help us to learn and remember things.
Yeah, absolutely.
And who doesn't love singing along to a good song?
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
So it's kind of like a sneaky way to learn
Sure,
English.
totally.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And the blog post also suggests finding a pen pal or using online chat rooms and forums.
Okay.
So what are the benefits of doing those things?
I think it's all about practicing your communication skills
Okay.
in a real world setting.
Right.
So if you're talking to a pen pal or you're chatting online, you're using English in a natural way. You're not just doing grammar exercises or memorizing vocabulary lists.
Yeah.
You're actually communicating.
And the blog post also mentions dictation exercises. Yeah. Expert speaker.